Hello, I'm Llewellyn King, host of White House Chronicle. Today we begin a new series of special programs produced in collaboration with the Pell Center and the Providence Journal. They're called Story in the Public Square and hosted by Jim Ludes and G. Wayne Miller.
Hello and welcome to White House Chronicle. This week we're bringing you a special edition, Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludes from the Pell Center at Salve, Regina University, alongside G. Wayne Miller from the Providence Journal. Story in the Public Square is an effort to study, celebrate, and tell stories that matter. So about once each month, Wayne and I will be in to talk to storytellers about their work and the impact they're having on public life. Llewellyn King and Linda Gasparella will be back next week, but we want to thank them for the opportunity. We're going to try very, very hard not to break their show. Our guest today is August Cole, co-author of Ghost Fleet, a novel of the next World War, a former journalist with the Wall Street Journal, and now also a fellow at the Atlantic Council, working to mine narrative fiction for insights about the future of war. August, thanks so much for being with us.
It's great to be here.
So you and your co-author, Peter Singer, are among two of the best-known defense thinkers in Washington. You, in your career as a journalist, helped break the story about China stealing plans for the F-35, an aircraft that plays a role in the book. Peter has written books on child soldiers, on robotics and cybersecurity. What led the two of you to collaborate on a work of fiction like this?
Well, we wanted to tackle one of the biggest questions out there. And when we started a few years ago, there wasn't a lot of conversation about the strategic challenge, or the threat really, that China posed. And we felt like fiction was a way to talk about this with a much bigger audience than if we'd written a nonfiction book or a series of white papers. It really opened the aperture. And some of the way people have been responding to the book, I think, reflects that. It's been received well within the military, but also there are plenty of people who are coming to this with a new understanding of why cybersecurity, for example, is important.
Can you expand on why you chose fiction? I mean, obviously you've written a lot of material, both as a journalist and as a member of a think tank and as a strategic and military thinker, but why fiction? Fiction is a particular genre that can do some things and can't do other things.
I mean, I think to start, I just love a really good story.
Well, that's a good, you came to the right place to talk about that.
My sense, and Pete's as well, was that there are some really big challenges in how to conceive of the future of warfare, and that a lot of the status quo ways to do it aren't really up to the task. By taking a fictional structure, a novel really, that was going to be fast-paced, enjoyable to read, but also useful, we could, in fact, get people to start thinking in a serious way about some of these challenges that weren't really being appreciated, but are starting to be talked about now.
You know, so and one of the things that I read, I think it was an Atlantic article where you and Peter described desire to produce useful fiction. What does that mean for you?
Endnotes. The book has 400 endnotes. You know, the idea was that you could have a book that would be engaging, that you didn't want to put down, and that it would prompt you when you went to your job on Monday, if you worked in the Pentagon or in the intelligence community or even in the private sector, to start thinking seriously about some of the things we bring up in the book, like hardware hacking, or the microchips on a fighter plane truly trustworthy, or could there be latent flaws in them that could expose them to a sort of kill switch or a homing signal for a missile? There are also bigger questions to think about, like, what is the future of the Communist Party in China? That's a really fascinating academic question, but when you explore it in a narrative way, as we did in the book, you can have a lot of fun and I think engage the reader in something that would otherwise be quite abstract, especially for an American reader.
Are there rules that you lived by in terms of, so this is a speculative fiction about an imagined future, are there rules that guided, as you thought about the future of the Communist Party? What informs the boundaries that you're willing to explore in this imagined future?
So as our path to create useful fiction was laid out before us, we wanted to have all the technology in the book in development or real. That was a really important foundational rule to set down and to adhere to. The trends that we walk forward, whether it's the dissatisfaction with the Communist Party that we see growing now, for example, in the financial space, the rising professionalism of the People's Liberation Army, our own military's assessed vulnerabilities in the cyber domain, all those are rooted in real risks or real trends. And so we wanted to walk that forward in a way that actually upset a lot of the conventional assumptions that people were bringing to the debates around the future of security. You know, it was essentially a chance to check blind spots, but also turn over the apple cart a bit.
So you got a very receptive audience in the military sphere, as it were. Also, I'm guessing in the political arena. Talk a little bit about that. I mean, who read this? What did they take from it? And how was their experience different than reading, say, a white paper or a classified briefing? Or
I think it's really interesting to see the connection that people are making between this book and a book Tom Clancy wrote in 1986 called Red Storm Rising. And actually for Pete and I, that book was game-changing for us. We were young, but it really got us thinking in a big, expansive way about war and about conflict. Our hope was to do something similar. It's why we took these sorts of different perspectives, so you can see the war through the eyes of a space privateer who's a billionaire, or an American insurgent in Hawaii, or a Chinese admiral. With all those different points of view, and I think with that resonance with that original Red Storm Rising kind of concept, the official military reaction has been really interesting because it's being treated as essentially useful fiction. The Marine Corps Commandant recently has been talking about the book regularly in public as being something to read. The Army itself has actually gravitated towards the book, even though there's a big warship on the cover. They've actually seen a lot of lessons learned in there around how to think about technology, when it's going to work, when it's not. And the Navy itself, of course, has been a really receptive reader in general in that community, all the way up to the Secretary of Navy and also smaller groups that are focused on innovation. Yeah. And all the services have tended to see it as useful.
What about the mainstream reader, the mainstream audience, somebody who's not in that sector, somebody who has no dog in the fight in terms of the military, as it were, just the average person reading it? And I've looked at the Amazon comments, there are hundreds of them, and it's clear to me that there are a lot of people who are not in that sector, who have nothing invested in technology or warfare or the future of warfare, who are reading it. What are you saying to these people? Why are they coming to this?
Well, the thriller genre is one of the most exciting to read for me personally, and so it's nice to see the book connect with them. We wanted to give people a good story first. I think that's really, really important when you're thinking about your role as a writer and trying to make a compelling case for the characters you've laid out, the world you've built. Yeah. And so to see the book resonate with people who aren't doing this in their day job, it means a lot, because there's some strength to the story itself. And so I think what they're getting in there is a picture of technologies today that are often talked about in very discrete ways. Yeah. People might talk about drones, but not necessarily how drones will operate alongside fighter planes in the future, which they will. Or better yet, if you're a pilot, what that might actually feel like. This human element to a highly technological type of warfare is often overlooked, but it's so important to understand.
So, since 2001, really, the U.S. military has been focused on small wars, right? The counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, even after the invasion of Iraq, the occupation, which was really about counterinsurgency, and part of that reality has been a set of assumptions that you could describe as a narrative. And the narrative said essentially that great power matters were largely settled, and the likelihood of a great power conflict was small. I think the events of the last 3 years maybe have got us rethinking that a little bit. But you imagine a world where the small wars are still there, but these big, great power issues still prevail. What, beyond just sort of wanting to tell a big story, are there trends that you see that give you pause for concern in terms of the future we're headed towards?
I think there's a lot of things to really track closely. China's military development is one of them. The way they're spending indicates that they have a desire to project power. Mm-hmm. That's why they're buying stealth fighters. That's why they're building a second aircraft carrier of their own design. The notion that small wars will become less frequent, I think, is wrong, and that those sorts of conflicts, unfortunately, are going to prevail globally, for whether it's due to proliferation of small arms or other economic drivers. But yet, we have to think about the big risk, and where does China see its place in the world, particularly vis-a-vis the Pacific, which, as they develop a blue water navy, a navy that can sail globally, that can use new ports in Africa, they are going to start to think about their role in protecting what's called the global commons, the way we count trade through the world's oceans, cyberspace for that matter, which is to some extent an extension of that concept. The one belt, one road idea that the Chinese government has right now is that their reach will be global, both economically but also strategically.
Do you think there is realistically a chance that there could be this type of war with China?
Our hope was to create a scenario that would scare people enough to realize that this was something that would not be easy. I think one of the most dangerous things to consider is that the U.S.-China conflict could be short or contained or quick. I think that's a risk that both the PLA but also the U.S. military run. And we wanted to show that this is the sort of attitude that could lead both nations down a very dangerous path with consequences far different than past wars. The home front, for example, being vulnerable to cyber attack, the allies that we have abandoning us, simply not being aligned anymore with our strategic interests. NATO's future as a U.S. partner, particularly in the context of a Pacific campaign, is totally up in the air. It is not at all certain.
Our economies, though, are so codependent, to use a sort of a therapeutic term here. What would motivate China to want to upset that balance? I mean, we really are two countries with many differences, but economically we are intertwined. Increasingly and increasingly. I mean, I don't have to tell you all that in terms of the companies there and the Chinese and the companies and the people here in terms of education, in terms of families back and forth. And I don't have the answer to that. I'm wondering, you clearly have assessed that, and so
we thought about that a lot. And the thing that really worried me was people said the exact same thing in 1913, before the First World War broke out. The notion that China's sense of its place in the world, and that we envision in the book is a regime running China that's different than the Communist Party, that has a very clear sense of its destiny, that I see as a more direct or almost linear kind of investment in a Chinese 21st century, which is, I think, part of what they wish, given their economic power. They'll be the world's largest economy within 10 years. They may be spending as much on defense as we are in 15 years or sooner, if growth rates continue, and I expect they will.
Have you had any reaction from readers in China or from
Not
politicians
yet.
in China?
Is it published in China?
It is not published in China. It will be available in Taiwan, and
so it'll make its way
therefore
over.
Hong Kong and Macau. So it'll make its way over there. I mean, that's a conversation I actually look forward to. I mean, to be able to sit around a table like this with PLA admirals and discuss the book with them would be
we'll have you back
great
for sure. Well,
I would love to.
When we
I would
get
love
the
to do
Chinese
that.
edition.
But I think that's an important question too. I mean, it goes to this very basic kind of sense of destiny. That's a theme throughout the book. We have it in terms of our characters, whether it's a father and son relationship, or what does war do to the individual? Are you changed fundamentally at almost like psychological level, even if you don't mean to be as a civilian? And then destiny as a nation. Is America a nation in decline? Is our reach and our impact being diminished, by our own actions? And is China's ascent a sure thing, or is there question about its rise? That's the kind of question we wanted to answer, and we used a novel to do it because we knew that people, once they started reading, wouldn't be able to put it down.
So we're going to explore a little bit more of this, but let me just say this is White House Chronicle. I'm Jim Ludes from the Pell Center at Salve, Regina University, alongside G. Wayne Miller from the Providence Journal. Llewellyn King and Linda Gasparillo will be back next week. We're going to take a moment here for station identification, primarily for the benefit of our listeners on Sirius XM Radio, channel 124, the POTUS channel. Heard throughout the United States and Canada, White House Chronicle can be heard 4 times every weekend. This program is also seen on the international stations of the Voice of America and on 200 American television stations. Our guest is August Cole, co-author of Ghost Fleet. So let me pick up on a criticism that I read about the book that you and Peter, and we've talked about it today, the impact of Red Storm Rising. This was a book that was written in mid-1980s by Tom Clancy, where there was a Cold War that was well established and well understood. The difference with what you've done here is you have imagined a conflictual relationship between the United States and China set in the future. For that young reader who is thinking about and is sort of enamored with this world that's been created, the same way I was enamored with Jack Ryan, is there a danger that the world that you're creating is yet to be created, whereas Red Storm Rising was a world that already existed? Are we preconditioning, or I think what critics would say that we're we're establishing a contested relationship with China that doesn't have to be.
I think the way we framed it is it's an act of fiction, not a work of prediction, or a work of fiction, not an act of prediction. That said, everything in the book is so rooted in reality that I do think it should stand as a cautionary tale in two ways. One is that the Chinese are quite clear in their strategic ambition. They're arming their PLA at a rate that outstrips any other nation in Asia, which, given their economic might, makes a lot of sense. But also it shows that, to what I said earlier about this risk that we could believe a conflict with China could be contained. Maybe it breaks out over ships trading paint in the South China Sea. Maybe it is a cyber campaign that escalates to
maybe it's an
something
accident that torches something and triggers something.
You know, the risk, I think, would be that a younger generation would look at all the technology around them and assume that America's dominance in the world is assured, and it's not. Even those who've invested their entire careers in military dominance know that deep inside, that many of the assumptions that we have had of the last, say, 15 to 20 years about America's technological dominance, that era is ending. You know, the proliferation and democratization of many disruptive technologies derived often from the commercial sphere. You know, this is true in the online realm. You know, you can see it with quadcopters, the drones that are marketed globally, to more advanced defense sales that the Chinese, for example, are doing, selling armed drones in the Middle East. The monopoly on military advantage that the U.S. held after the Cold War is over, and that has profound implications. And I think a lot of people still haven't figured that out, both in government but also at a younger generation. And I think it's a healthy thing to consider.
Well, and it comes through crystal clear in the book. The book is it's a page turner, and we don't want to give anything away.
I'm dying to give something away, but I won't. I won't.
But there was one passage that really struck me, and I'm just very quickly. You wrote, "We need to become again the country that breaks the hard problems, that sees the virtue in innovation and the reward in risk. If we do not succeed, then I worry that all truly is lost." There were a couple of laments that I heard in reading the book, and one is that America is not the problem that breaks the hard problems anymore. What are those laments that you put into this book to sort of help us understand maybe the path that we're on?
Well, one of the fascinating things about the book is that we pit China and America against one another, which should be bureaucracy versus bureaucracy, but it's not. You know, we have entrepreneurs taking frontline roles in space and in cyberspace. We have almost a kind of junkyard, you know, hot rod modification approach to naval warfare that's driven by the exigency of our declining shipbuilding in the U.S. You know, the sense that we wove into the book was that the answers to this kind of existential crisis, if the U.S. were to face it, wouldn't come from the usual suspects. And in fact would be this innovative spirit, this risk-taking community that's in tech, who would really be driving a lot of the solutions. And some of that reflects the nature of war that's changing, it's going more digital. But even when you have the first naval battle in more than 70 years, like we posit in the book, that still is very much a product not of an establishment approach, a very bureaucratized industrial complex. It's rather something far more innovative and kind of upstart, despite it representing what, you know, arguably is, you know, the greatest nation in the world.
There's no question that it's an absolute page turner. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here because I'm a writer and I like to know process and writing, and I'm going to get to that in 1 second. First question, though, I can so see this as a movie.
Yeah.
Will this be a movie?
Well, you know, to your point about process, I wrote it and Pete wrote it like a movie. When we would talk about it, we talked about it very visually. Either films or video games we liked.
It's a good frame of
Well,
mind.
the first section of the book too. You're right there.
It's meant to be a very visual experience, even though you're reading it. And I think that's why the audiobook has worked really well for a lot of people too, is that it really puts you in that place. I don't know if it'll be a film or not. I think it's difficult right now to make films about conflict with China for the simple reason a blockbuster has to have a China market angle to it. And that's not something I think that would pass the censors right now. That may change in the future.
It would probably be a high budget film too.
I think it would need to be to kind of capture the kind of scope that we talk about. At the same time, you know, there are these elements really low tech to the story too, where it's not all special effects. You know, we play with the idea of insurgency, but in the most kind of primitive sense, as being the actual only way to defeat a high tech adversary. So, you know, if the adversary has exosuits and quadcopter drones and the ability to see in the dark, what do you do? Well, you go low tech. And I think that's actually another really important theme in the book, tied to this generational relationship with technology, that in fact the answer, particularly in conflict, may sometimes be to reduce things down to their most fundamental level, not to layer more and more complexity or more engineering on a solution, because that can be vulnerability.
Co-writing, I know from experience, is a very difficult challenge. I've done it with one book that worked out well because I had a co-writer who was a great guy. It's not a frequent occurrence in novels. Right. The only example that I can think of, the prominent example, would be Peter Straub and Stephen King. Stephen King, one of my favorite authors, have collaborated, co-written 2 books, and apparently are working on a 3rd. And they talk about their process. They started with the Bible, and that grew out of discussions by email, by phone calls, by occasional meeting, and then they traded off. Stephen would write one section, hand it over to Peter. Peter would write the next, and back and forth. How did you guys do it?
We came up with the mother of all outlines. But
Is it longer than the book?
Almost.
Almost.
The idea, though, was to have something akin to this Bible that you're talking about.
Yeah.
We also knew that Red Storm Rising was actually co-written. It was Larry Bond who worked with Tom Clancy.
That's right.
So that gave us heart that this could work.
That too.
I'd forgotten that.
And we get along well personally. We have a lot of similar references in terms of our films we like, books we like to read. We, at the same time, though, have different ways of thinking and approaching things. And if you're collaborating with someone, I think one of the most important things you can ask them is, what do you like to do and what do you not like to do in the process? And while we co-wrote literally every page, we often liken it to 3D printing. If the outline was our sort of software program, we would pass the manuscript back and forth. I work in the early morning. Pete tends to work more at night when it comes to fiction. And so we literally layered over and over on each other. And we had a very good editor in Eamon Dolan. And I think that is also not to be overlooked if you're teaming, to have someone who can really kind of drive you both.
Yeah, sort of the ringmaster, really.
There's nothing, I'm familiar with both of your writing styles, and it's seamless. It's not like, oh yeah, Peter wrote that piece and August wrote that.
There's no sense of.
We wanted to avoid any, an academic book, for example, or if we'd done a nonfiction version of this book, we might have alternated chapters.
Right.
Pete might have written something on, say, cybersecurity because he'd just done a nonfiction book on that. We really wanted to avoid that and to have it seamless. And it actually is more fun that way, because you check each other's blind spots better, both creatively. I wrote another manuscript myself, and there would be a problem you'd be working on in your own head for 30 days, and you could do it in 30 minutes, in a phone call with your collaborator.
It's a book about conflict. Was there any conflict between the 2 writers?
We generally were aligned early on, so anything we needed to resolve we did during the outline phase, because both of us didn't want to waste any time or any effort, because this was a big task. Both of us, our first fiction book. Yeah. And so we hammered all that out early on, so that when it got to the writing of the book, we got good feedback from our editor early on that forced us to double down, I think, on some of our character development and a few things. So I think
you sound like you're easy to work with. We'll talk after the show. I've got a few co-writing ideas.
So I don't want to leave anything on the table in terms of the book, but I do want to make sure that we spend a little time talking about the project that you're running at the Atlantic Council, The Art of Future War. Tell us a little bit about what that is.
So the Art of Future Warfare project really is based on started with asking an open-ended question. Could artists contribute both in their visions of the future, but also their methodology to the national security community? So over the past year, we held a series of events that were tied to crowdsourced writing or visual art contests, and centered around a website we made, which was artoffuturewarfare.org. We built this community, essentially month by month, reaching out to the gaming community, sci-fi community. There is also this really great moment in Washington right now where professional military thinking is very much leaning towards the importance of writing in expressing and exchanging ideas. That's part of the reason why Ghost Fleet is resonating with every one of the armed services. Yeah. And so the project is aligned around that, and it's somewhat serendipitous that that's the moment we're in, but also I think that's the part of the genesis of the project, which was the strategy community, the kind of strategic thinking that's going on, needs a little narrative nudge to capture the breadth of audience to solve a lot of these problems.
Well, so this is one of the questions that I had. I know that you've worked with the Marine Corps, for example, to help them do some imagining around their future, their predictions about the future. Is it a matter of spicing up the narrative so that people are more likely to slog through a 137-page treat us about the future of technology and conflict? Or is there some additional analytical value that you get from, setting aside the technical documents and thinking creatively?
I think the analytical value is that fiction or vignettes draw out the human element, and that's often lost in a big white paper. And so with what the Marine Corps was working on, it's a strategic environment forecast looking at 2030 to 2045. And it's a great document with some baseline futures, alternative futures, following the traditional, let's think about the future foresight model. And so what we are doing with the project is working with actual Marines who are writers themselves, who are drawn from throughout the entire Marine Corps.
Very cool.
Yeah, and kind of coaching them and doing literally a writing workshop.
And they like it.
They do. They're very enthused by it because there is incredible talent residing within uniform.
Absolutely.
And within other agencies and departments of government too. And so I don't think people have been given in the past the chance. And so what's nice now is that there are generals who are willing to say, that's important. Let's fund that. Let's approach that in a new way to engage not only the traditional captains and majors and colonels, but let's think about the privates, the corporals, because they're the ones who, if they stay in the service for 15 or 20 years, will be actually the people living out many of these vignettes and scenarios.
They're the backbone of the military, of course.
Right. Yeah. Do you see who are the others that you're working with? What is the audience for this? I know that you had a successful conference last year on this project. Where's the future for the art of future warfare?
So one of the interesting projects right now, we're working on a future trends project with Matt Burrows at the Atlantic Council, who used to do a lot of this foresight work for the intelligence community. And so we're creating a kind of baseline for 2035. It's called Global Trends. And so we're going to be helping that process by doing a bit of red teaming, meaning taking assumptions and pushing back, but also developing narrative and other vignettes.
And are there other authors, so you talk about using folks who've been drawn from the Marine Corps, but are there other people who are working in the space of techno-thrillers, filmmakers, video game makers?
When we went to Quantico early in February, one of our fellows came from the Atlantic Council, and that was Max Brooks, who wrote World War Z. Which has been a tremendously important book in the defense community because it is such a compelling exploration of breakdown of how thin the kind of line is between order and chaos, but also if things got really bad, what would we do as a functioning society about it? And so Max is a fellow. Dave Anthony, who directed the Call of Duty Black Ops 2 game, which was one of the most successful ever, is also a fellow for his ability to think clearly about the future, but also for his experience managing teams on zero defect standard schedules where you have real make or break budgets that if you fail, you are going to be in a lot of trouble. And he's someone who can talk at great length about how to motivate people, how to encourage creativity, how to create an environment where there are no bad ideas and to mean it, because again, the outcome is what makes that worthwhile.
I feel like we've just scratched the surface with August,
I want to see the sequel too.
Seriously, but we're out of time. But we want to thank you for being with us today. The book is Ghost Fleet. It's a fantastic read, and we want to thank Llewellyn King and Linda Gasparella for lending us the keys to White House Chronicle. They'll be back next week, and if you want to know more about Story in the Public Square, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter, or visit pellcenter.org. Wayne and I will see you again next month. Thank you for watching.